Marcus Rodriguez stood at the bus stop on Madison Street, shifting his weight from one foot to the other as he checked his watch for the third time in 5 minutes. The morning air was crisp, and commuters were beginning to fill the sidewalks as another workday began in downtown Seattle. At 34, Marcus carried himself with the disciplined posture that marked him as former military, though few would guess the depth of his service record just by looking at him. The bus was running late again. Marcus pulled his phone from his jacket pocket to check the transit app, scrolling through the delayed arrival times with growing frustration. He had an important appointment at the Veterans Affairs office across town, something he'd been putting off for months. The recurring nightmares and flashbacks from his 3 tours in Afghanistan had been getting worse, and his wife Sarah had finally convinced him to seek help. A police cruiser pulled up to the curb about 50 feet away, and 2 officers stepped out. Marcus glanced over briefly, but thought nothing of it. Urban policing was routine in this part of the city, and he'd grown accustomed to the constant presence of law enforcement during his daily commute. He turned his attention back to his phone, responding to a text message from Sarah asking if he'd remembered to take his medication that morning. Officer James Patterson approached the bus stop with his partner, Officer Lisa Chun, following a few steps behind. They'd received a call about a suspicious person loitering in the area, though the details had been vague. The caller had mentioned someone acting agitated and potentially dangerous near the transit stop. As they walked closer, Patterson's eyes settled on Marcus, who was now pacing slightly while waiting for the bus. "Excuse me, sir," Patterson called out, his hand instinctively moving closer to his utility belt. "Could we have a word with you?" Marcus looked up from his phone, confusion crossing his face. "Me? What's this about, officer?" "We receive a report about someone causing a disturbance in this area," Chen added, positioning herself at an angle that would allow her to observe Marcus's hands and body language. "Have you seen anything unusual this morning?" "No, nothing at all," Marcus replied honestly. "I've just been waiting for the bus for about 15 minutes. It's running late today." Patterson studied Marcus's demeanor carefully. Something about the man's posture and the way he held himself reminded the officer of his brother, who'd served in Iraq. But there was also a tension in Marcus's movements that made Patterson feel uneasy. "Can I see some identification, please?" Marcus felt his heart rate begin to increase. The simple request triggered something deep in his mind, a conditioned response from years of checkpoint duties and hostile encounters overseas. He reached slowly for his wallet, his movements deliberate and controlled. "Sure, officer. No problem." As Marcus pulled out his driver's license, a city bus rumbled past without stopping, apparently full. The sudden noise and vibration caused him to flinch involuntarily, his body reacting to what his brain interpreted as a potential threat. The movement was slight, but Patterson noticed it immediately. "Sir, I need you to keep your hands where I can see them," Patterson said, his voice taking on a more authoritative tone. "Are you under the influence of anything this morning?" "No, sir, I'm not," Marcus responded, his military training kicking in as he addressed the officer with automatic respect. "I'm a veteran. I was just startled by the bus. Sometimes loud noises affect me." Chun exchanged a glance with her partner. Veterans could be unpredictable, especially those dealing with post-traumatic stress. She'd attended several training sessions on handling encounters with former service members, but the protocols seemed different in real-world situations. Marcus handed over his license, noting the slight tremor in his own hand. The interaction was bringing back memories he'd been working hard to suppress. Images of roadside checkpoints, hostile crowds, and split-second decisions that could mean life or death began flooding his consciousness. He took a deep breath, trying to employ the coping techniques his therapist had taught him. "Marcus Rodriguez," Patterson read from the license. "Address shows you live in Ballard. What brings you downtown this morning?" "I have an appointment," Marcus answered, deliberately keeping his response brief. He'd learned from experience that providing too much information could sometimes complicate simple interactions with authority figures. "What kind of appointment?" Chun pressed, her training telling her to gather as much information as possible about the subject's intentions and state of mind. Marcus hesitated. There was still stigma around mental health treatment, especially for veterans. He'd seen too many fellow soldiers face discrimination in employment and other areas after seeking help for psychological wounds. "It's personal," he said finally. Patterson interpreted the evasive answer as potentially suspicious. Combined with Marcus's earlier flinching and apparent nervousness, he began to consider the possibility that this might be the individual the caller had been concerned about. "Sir, I'm going to need you to be more specific about your business downtown." The pressure was mounting, and Marcus could feel his anxiety levels rising. His palms began to sweat, and his breathing became slightly more rapid. These were warning signs he'd learned to recognize, indicators that he might be approaching a state where his military training and trauma responses could override his rational thinking. "Look, officers, I really haven't done anything wrong," Marcus said, his voice carrying a note of frustration. "I'm just trying to catch a bus to get to an appointment. I'm already running late because of the delay." Patterson made a decision that would change everything. "I need you to turn around and place your hands on the bus stop sign," he instructed, reaching for his handcuffs. "We're going to conduct a brief search to make sure you're not carrying anything dangerous." Marcus felt the world begin to shift around him. The simple bus stop encounter was escalating into something that felt all too familiar from his military service. His body tensed automatically, prepared to respond to what his trauma-conditioned mind was interpreting as a threat situation. "Officer, this really isn't necessary," Marcus said, his voice strained but still controlled. "I'm not armed, and I haven't committed any crime. I just want to catch the next bus." But Patterson had already committed to the search procedure, and Chen was moving to support her partner. They approached Marcus with the practiced efficiency of officers who'd conducted hundreds of similar stops, unaware that they were about to encounter someone whose body and mind had been trained for combat situations far more intense than anything they'd experienced in their law enforcement careers. The morning commuters continued to stream past, most too absorbed in their own routines to pay much attention to what appeared to be a routine police interaction. None of them could have predicted that within minutes, this simple misunderstanding would trigger a chain of events that would involve federal agencies and transform an ordinary Tuesday morning into something that would be talked about for years to come. Marcus's hands shook slightly as he reluctantly began to turn toward the bus stop sign, every instinct in his body screaming that he was walking into a trap. His military identification tags, hidden beneath his shirt, felt suddenly heavy against his chest, carrying with them the weight of secrets and experiences that few civilians could understand. As Marcus slowly turned toward the bus stop sign, his mind began to fracture along familiar lines. The Seattle street faded away, replaced by dusty Afghan roads where every civilian interaction could be a deadly trap. His hands moved toward the metal post, but in his mind he was 19 again, approaching a suspected improvised explosive device while his squad provided overwatch from 50 meters away. Officer Patterson stepped closer, his radio crackling with routine dispatcher chatter. The sound triggered another memory cascade in Marcus's brain. Radio static meant incoming intelligence, potential threats, and the need for immediate action. His heart rate spiked to over 130 beats per minute as his body prepared for combat that existed only in his traumatized memories. "Sir, place your hands flat against the sign and spread your feet," Patterson instructed, following standard procedure for a pat-down search. He was completely unaware that his subject was no longer mentally present at the bus stop. Marcus's training took over. In Afghanistan, he'd been part of an elite intelligence unit, specializing in high-value target identification and extraction. His reflexes had been honed through thousands of hours of combat simulations and real-world operations where hesitation meant death. Now, those same reflexes were interpreting two Seattle police officers as hostile forces in a combat zone. "I can't do this," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "I can't do this again." Chen noticed the change in his demeanor immediately. "Partner, something's not right here," she said quietly to Patterson, instinctively taking a step back. But it was too late. Marcus spun around with the fluid motion of someone trained in close-quarters combat, his eyes wild and unfocused. He wasn't seeing two Seattle police officers anymore. Instead, he was facing Taliban fighters who had somehow infiltrated his position, threatening him and his unit. "Contact front," Marcus shouted, using military terminology that meant nothing to the officers, but everything to his fractured psyche. "Hostile forces at the checkpoint." Patterson reacted with trained police instincts, reaching for his service weapon while simultaneously calling for backup on his radio. "Shots fired, request backup," he yelled, though no shots had actually been fired yet. Chun drew her taser, recognizing that the situation had escalated beyond their ability to control with verbal commands alone. She'd attended crisis intervention training that covered dealing with veterans experiencing psychological episodes, but the classroom scenarios had seemed much more manageable than the reality she now faced. Marcus moved with frightening precision, his body operating on muscle memory developed through years of military training. He disarmed Chin's taser before she could fire it, his movements so fast that bystanders later said it looked like a choreographed dance. But instead of using the weapon against the officers, he threw it aside and backed against the bus stop shelter. "Stay back," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to life-or-death command decisions. "I won't let you compromise the mission." More police units began arriving within minutes, their sirens adding to the chaos that was feeding Marcus's delusions. Each new siren meant more enemy reinforcements in his mind, confirming his belief that he was under attack. The original simple misunderstanding had snowballed into something much larger and more dangerous. Detective Sarah Morrison arrived on scene as the 4th Police Unit pulled up. She'd spent 15 years working with crisis situations and had developed a reputation for being able to de-escalate confrontations that other officers couldn't handle. As she stepped out of her unmarked car, she quickly assessed the situation and realized they were dealing with someone experiencing a severe psychological episode. "What's his name?" Morrison asked Patterson as she approached the perimeter they'd established around Marcus. "Marcus Rodriguez. Claims he's a veteran," Patterson replied, still breathing heavily from the adrenaline surge of the encounter. Morrison nodded, her mind already working through the approach she'd use. She'd seen dozens of similar situations over the years, usually triggered by anniversary dates, personal stress, or unexpected confrontations with authority figures. The key was to avoid further traumatizing the subject while ensuring public safety. Marcus had positioned himself with his back to the bus shelter, maintaining visual contact with all the officers while scanning for escape routes. His tactical thinking was still sharp, even though his perception of reality was completely compromised. He was applying lessons learned from urban warfare to a situation that posed no actual threat to his life. "Marcus," Morrison called out, her voice calm, but loud enough to cut through his mental chaos. "My name is Detective Morrison. I need to talk to you about getting home safely." The word home penetrated Marcus's defensive mental barriers. For a moment, the street came back into focus, and he saw the police officers as they really were rather than as enemy combatants. But the moment of clarity was brief, quickly overwhelmed by the continuing sensory overload of sirens, radio chatter, and armed figures surrounding him. "This is Delta 7-2 requesting immediate extraction," Marcus said, using his old military call sign and speaking as if he were communicating with a command center. "Position is compromised. Multiple hostiles in civilian clothing." Morrison recognized the military terminology and adjusted her approach accordingly. She'd worked with enough veterans to understand that Marcus was experiencing a flashback so severe that he'd completely lost touch with present reality. The challenge would be gradually bringing him back to the present without triggering an even more violent response. Meanwhile, the commotion was drawing attention from federal monitoring systems that tracked unusual police activity in major cities. Automated algorithms designed to identify potential terrorist incidents or other national security threats began flagging the incident involving multiple police units, an individual with apparent military training, and what appeared to be an active confrontation in a major urban center. Marcus reached into his jacket pocket to retrieve what he believed was a communication device to contact his commanding officer. In reality, it was just his cell phone, but his movement toward his jacket triggered immediate responses from every officer present. Multiple voices shouted commands simultaneously, creating a cacophony that further fragmented Marcus's already tenuous grip on reality. Chun, still shaken from having her taser taken away so easily, radioed in a more detailed description of Marcus's capabilities. Subject displays advanced combat training and disarmed officer without apparent effort. Recommend tactical response team for public safety. Those words, advanced combat training and tactical response team, were exactly the kind of language that would catch the attention of federal monitoring systems. Within minutes, the incident was being analyzed by computer programs designed to identify potential domestic terrorism threats or other situations requiring federal intervention. Marcus, still believing he was in Afghanistan, began applying counter-surveillance techniques he'd learned during his intelligence training. He was looking for sniper positions, escape routes, and other tactical considerations that made perfect sense in a combat zone, but appeared threatening and unpredictable to the officers trying to contain the situation. The gap between Marcus's military training and the officers' police training was becoming more apparent with each passing minute. While both groups were professionals trained to handle dangerous situations, they were operating from completely different tactical frameworks and threat assessments. Detective Morrison realized she needed to try a different approach. Instead of treating Marcus as a criminal or even as a person in crisis, she needed to treat him as a soldier who believed he was still at war. The challenge would be finding a way to give him an honorable way to stand down without losing face or compromising what he perceived as his mission. Within 6 minutes of the initial confrontation, federal monitoring systems had flagged the incident for immediate review. The combination of keywords and police radio transmissions had triggered an automated alert system designed to identify potential national security threats. An algorithm analyzing police communications had detected references to military training, tactical capabilities, and an individual who had successfully disarmed law enforcement officers in an urban environment. At the Department of Homeland Security's Fusion Center in Portland, Oregon, analyst David Chun was reviewing the automated alert when his screen lit up with a priority notification. The system had classified the Seattle incident as a potential domestic terrorism event based on the subject's apparent military background and demonstrated combat capabilities. Standard protocol required immediate escalation to federal agencies within 10 minutes of initial detection. Meanwhile, back at the bus stop, Detective Morrison was trying to establish communication with Marcus using military protocol she'd learned during her own brief stint in the National Guard years earlier. "Soldier Rodriguez," she called out, using his rank structure to try to penetrate his flashback. "This is command. What's your status report?" Marcus's head snapped toward Morrison's voice. For a moment, the familiar military communication pattern registered in his traumatized mind as something approaching normal. "Command, this is Delta 7-2, he responded automatically. "Position is under attack. Request immediate backup and medical evacuation for wounded personnel." Morrison realized Marcus was reliving a specific incident from his military service, probably one involving casualties. This information would be crucial for properly de-escalating the situation, but she needed to be careful not to trigger even more traumatic memories while trying to guide him back to reality. "Delta 7-2, command copies your transmission," Morrison responded, playing along with his military framework while trying to gradually introduce elements of present-day reality. "Can you provide a visual assessment of your current environment?" Marcus began scanning the area with the methodical precision of a soldier conducting reconnaissance. His eyes moved systematically from building to building, identifying potential sniper positions and escape routes. To the assembled police officers, his behavior looked increasingly threatening and unpredictable. "Command, I count 12 hostile personnel in defensive positions," Marcus reported, referring to the police officers surrounding him. "They're equipped with standard small arms and are maintaining overwatch positions." no heavy weapons visible. At the DHS Fusion Center, David Chun was now coordinating with the FBI's Domestic Terrorism Unit and the Pentagon's Force Protection Agency. The subject's apparent ability to conduct tactical assessments while under stress had elevated the threat level even higher. Federal protocol required treating any individual with advanced military training who was engaged in an active confrontation with law enforcement as a potential high-value threat until proven otherwise. Special Agent Jennifer Walsh from the FBI Seattle Field Office received the alert while conducting a routine counterterrorism briefing at the federal building downtown. The proximity of the incident to her location meant she would be the first federal responder on scene. As she gathered her gear and headed for the door, she was already coordinating with Pentagon security specialists who had unique expertise in dealing with situations involving current or former military personnel. Back at the bus stop, more local resources were arriving. A SWAT team had been dispatched after Chen's report about Marcus's combat capabilities, and their tactical vehicle could be seen approaching from 3 blocks away. The sound of the heavy vehicle's engine was exactly the wrong audio trigger for someone experiencing combat flashbacks. Marcus immediately identified the approaching SWAT vehicle as an enemy armored personnel carrier. His military training kicked into high gear as he began calculating firing angles, cover positions, and the best way to engage what he perceived as an incoming assault force. "Command, we have heavy armor moving to our position," Marcus radioed to his imaginary headquarters, requesting permission to engage with available ordnance. Detective Morrison realized the situation was about to become much more dangerous. She tried desperately to maintain the military communication framework that seemed to be keeping Marcus somewhat responsive. Delta 7-2, command orders you to maintain defensive posture only. Do not engage unless directly fired upon. The instruction worked temporarily, causing Marcus to take cover behind the bus shelter instead of moving to engage the approaching SWAT team. But his tactical positioning made him appear even more threatening to the officers, who saw him using the shelter as a defensive fortification. Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Hayes from the Pentagon's Crisis Response Team received the alert at her office in Washington, D.C. The automated system had identified Marcus as a former member of an elite intelligence unit with specialized training in urban warfare and high-value target operations. His service record indicated psychological commendations for performance under extreme stress, but also flagged multiple combat deployments with potential for trauma-related issues. Hayes immediately initiated contact with the Seattle Police Department's incident commander, offering federal resources and expertise in handling situations involving former special operations personnel. She also began reviewing Marcus's classified service record to identify specific triggers and potential de-escalation strategies based on his military background. At the scene, Special Agent Walsh arrived just as the SWAT team was establishing their perimeter. She quickly assessed the situation and realized that the heavy police presence was likely making things worse for someone experiencing combat-related psychological distress. She requested that the tactical team maintain their positions but avoid any actions that might be interpreted as aggressive by someone with Marcus's training and current mental state. Marcus was now fully operating in what military psychologists call a combat-affective state while experiencing severe psychological distress. His body was flooded with adrenaline and stress hormones. His reflexes were operating at peak efficiency, and his tactical thinking was sharp despite his complete disconnection from present reality. This combination made him extremely dangerous, but also meant that traditional police de-escalation techniques would be largely ineffective. Dr. Patricia Williams, a VA psychologist who specialized in combat-related PTSD, received an emergency call from the FBI requesting immediate consultation on the incident. Based on the description of Marcus's behavior and military background, she recognized the signs of a severe dissociative episode triggered by unexpected confrontation with authority figures. Williams explained to the federal coordinators that Marcus was likely reliving a specific traumatic incident from his military service, probably one involving an ambush or attack on his unit. The key to resolving the situation would be finding a way to complete the psychological loop his mind was stuck in, allowing him to process the current situation as separate from his traumatic memories. The challenge was that any attempt to physically restrain or overwhelm Marcus would likely trigger even more severe defensive responses. His military training had prepared him for exactly those scenarios, and his compromised mental state meant he would interpret such actions as confirmation that he was under attack. Walsh coordinated with Detective Morrison to maintain the military communication framework, while federal specialists worked to identify the specific incident Marcus was reliving. If they could determine what had happened to him in Afghanistan, they might be able to guide him through a resolution that didn't involve violence. Meanwhile, Marcus was becoming increasingly agitated as more personnel continued to arrive on scene. In his mind, the enemy force was growing larger and more threatening with each passing minute. He began preparing for what he believed would be an inevitable assault on his position. The federal response team was now treating the incident as a potential broken arrow situation, military terminology for an accident involving nuclear weapons or other classified materials. While Marcus didn't have access to such materials, his security clearance level and specialized training meant that his actions while under psychological distress could potentially compromise sensitive national security information. Time was running out for a peaceful resolution, and everyone involved knew that the longer the situation continued, the more likely it became that someone would be seriously injured or killed. The expertise being brought to bear on the situation was unprecedented for a simple bus stop encounter. But Marcus's unique background and current mental state had transformed a routine police interaction into a federal incident with national security implications. At exactly 14 minutes after the initial police contact, a convoy of black SUVs arrived at the scene. The Pentagon's crisis response team had deployed from Joint Base Lewis McChord, bringing with them specialists in psychological operations and personnel with intimate knowledge of Marcus's former unit. Leading the team was Major James Crawford, who had served as Marcus's commanding officer during his final deployment in Afghanistan. Crawford stepped out of the lead vehicle and immediately assessed the tactical situation with the eye of someone who had managed similar scenarios in combat zones. He could see that Marcus had positioned himself defensively behind the bus shelter, maintaining visual contact with all potential threats while keeping multiple escape routes available. It was textbook urban warfare positioning, exactly what Crawford had taught him years earlier. "I need direct communication with the subject," Crawford told Special Agent Walsh as he reviewed Marcus's service file on a tablet. The classified details painted a picture of an exemplary soldier who had volunteered for increasingly dangerous missions, ultimately earning commendations for operations that couldn't be publicly acknowledged. Detective Morrison briefed Crawford on her attempts to maintain military communication protocol with Marcus. He responds to command structure, but he's clearly reliving something specific from his deployment. He keeps referencing wounded personnel and requesting medical evacuation. Crawford's expression darkened as he read further into Marcus's file. He now knew exactly which incident Marcus was reliving, and it explained why the situation had escalated so rapidly. 3 years earlier, Marcus's intelligence unit had been ambushed during a routine checkpoint operation near Kandahar. 2 members of his team had been killed, and Marcus had been forced to hold a defensive position alone for 4 hours while waiting for extraction. "He's not just having a flashback," Crawford explained to the assembled federal agents. "He's mentally back at Firebase Delta on March 15th, 2022. His team was compromised, and he thinks he's still protecting wounded soldiers." This information changed everything. Walsh immediately understood why traditional police de-escalation hadn't worked and why Marcus's responses seemed so tactically sophisticated. He wasn't just a veteran having a psychological episode. He was a decorated intelligence operative reliving the worst day of his military career. Dr. Williams, who had arrived on scene via emergency helicopter transport, began developing a specific intervention strategy based on Marcus's service record and the details of the incident he was reliving. The challenge would be finding a way to give his subconscious mind permission to leave the firebase and return to the present. Crawford moved closer to the police perimeter, but stayed far enough back to avoid triggering Marcus's defensive responses. "Sergeant Rodriguez," he called out, using Marcus's former rank and projecting his voice with the authority that had once commanded respect on dangerous missions. "This is Major Crawford. Do you copy?" Marcus's head snapped toward the familiar voice. For the first time since the incident began, his expression showed recognition rather than pure defensive alertness. Crawford's voice was a sound he associated with safety, competent leadership, and successful mission completion. "Major Crawford?" Marcus responded, his voice carrying a note of confusion as past and present began to overlap in his mind. "How did you get to the firebase?" Command said all routes were compromised. Crawford felt his heart sink as he heard the genuine confusion in his former soldier's voice. Marcus wasn't pretending or being difficult. He was genuinely trapped in a nightmare that had never fully ended. "Sergeant, I'm here to complete your extraction. Your mission is accomplished. The wounded have been evacuated." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. In the real incident at Firebase Delta, the medical evacuation had arrived too late for his teammates. The guilt and survivor's remorse had been eating at him for years, manifesting in nightmares and flashbacks that no amount of therapy had been able to fully resolve. "Negative, sir," Marcus replied, his voice strained with emotion. "I still have wounded personnel in my position. I cannot abandon my post." Dr. Williams stepped forward, speaking quietly to Crawford. "He's stuck in a trauma loop. His mind won't let him leave the firebase because he believes abandoning his position would dishonor his fallen teammates. We need to give him a way to complete the mission honorably." Crawford understood immediately. Marcus needed to hear that his teammates were safe, that his vigil had served its purpose, and that he had permission to stand down. It would require Crawford to participate in the therapeutic fiction, but it might be the only way to bring Marcus back to reality without violence. "Sergeant Rodriguez, this is Major Crawford with urgent mission update," Crawford announced, using the formal communication style that Marcus would recognize from their time in Afghanistan. "Medical evacuation was successful. All personnel have been recovered. Your position is no longer required for mission success." Marcus remained silent for several long moments, processing information that his trauma-conditioned mind wanted to reject. The idea that his teammates were safe contradicted everything he'd been reliving for the past 3 years. Meanwhile, federal coordinators were managing a complex multi-agency response that now included the FBI, Department of Homeland Security, Pentagon Crisis Response Team, and VA medical personnel. The incident had been classified as a broken arrow psychological emergency, requiring specialized handling protocols that few law enforcement agencies had ever encountered. The media had also begun to take notice of the heavy federal presence at what appeared to be a routine police incident. News helicopters were being redirected away from the area by FAA emergency orders, and local reporters were being kept at a distance by federal agents who couldn't explain why a simple bus stop confrontation required Pentagon involvement. Marcus's wife, Sarah, had been notified by the Red Cross that her husband was involved in a federal emergency incident. She was now en route to the scene with a VA counselor, carrying with her photos and personal items that might help ground Marcus in present-day reality if other intervention methods failed. "Major, I need visual confirmation of the extraction," Marcus said, his voice still carrying the disciplined tone of a soldier following protocol. "I cannot abandon my position based on radio communication alone." Crawford realized that Marcus needed to see evidence that his mission was complete. He turned to Dr. Williams and Agent Walsh, explaining that they would need to stage a medical evacuation scenario to satisfy Marcus's psychological need to see his teammates safely removed from the battlefield. The federal response team quickly improvised a solution. 2 paramedics were instructed to approach Marcus's position carrying empty stretchers, simulating the medical evacuation that his mind needed to witness. It was an unprecedented use of therapeutic role-playing in a federal emergency response, but the stakes were too high for conventional approaches. As the paramedics moved toward the bus shelter carrying their stretchers, Marcus's expression began to change. For the first time in almost an hour, his rigid military posture started to relax slightly. His subconscious mind was finally seeing the completion of a scenario that had been torturing him for years. "Extraction complete, Sergeant," Crawford announced as the paramedics passed by Marcus's position with their stretchers. "All personnel accounted for. You are cleared to return to base." Marcus Rodriguez, decorated veteran and intelligence specialist, slowly stepped out from behind the bus shelter. The Seattle street gradually came back into focus as his mind began to distinguish between past trauma and present reality. But the federal machinery that had been mobilized to resolve his personal crisis was just beginning to process the implications of what had happened. The incident would ultimately require congressional briefing, policy reviews, and new protocols for handling veterans experiencing severe psychological distress in public settings. What had started as a missed bus had become a case study in the intersection of military training, psychological trauma, and federal emergency response. As Marcus stepped away from the bus shelter, the weight of present reality slowly began to settle over him like a heavy blanket. The sounds of Seattle traffic, the smell of coffee from a nearby cafe, and the concerned faces of strangers all contributed to pulling him back from the battlefield that had existed only in his mind. Major Crawford approached slowly, his hands visible and his posture non-threatening, exactly as he would have approached a wounded soldier in a real combat zone. "Marcus," Crawford said softly, dropping the formal military tone now that the immediate crisis had passed. "You're in Seattle. It's Tuesday morning, and you're safe. Sarah is on her way." The mention of his wife's name completed the bridge between past and present. Marcus looked around with growing awareness, seeing the police officers, federal agents, and emergency responders who had mobilized to resolve what his traumatized mind had interpreted as a life-or-death combat situation. The magnitude of what had happened began to sink in, bringing with it a crushing wave of embarrassment and self-recrimination. "Oh God," Marcus whispered, his voice breaking as he fully comprehended the scene around him. "What have I done?" Dr. Williams stepped forward, her training in combat trauma allowing her to recognize the dangerous shift from hypervigilance to self-blame that often followed severe dissociative episodes. "Marcus, you haven't done anything wrong. You experienced a medical emergency, and everyone here understands that." But Marcus was already spiraling into the kind of self-criticism that had been plaguing him since his return from Afghanistan. He saw the disrupted traffic, the worried faces of commuters who had been evacuated from the area, and the massive law enforcement response that his personal crisis had triggered. In his mind, he had failed again, just as he believed he had failed his teammates at Firebase Delta. Agent Walsh began the complex process of documenting the incident for federal review. The response had been textbook perfect from a crisis management perspective, but it had also revealed significant gaps in how various agencies handle veterans experiencing severe psychological distress. The case would become a training scenario studied at federal law enforcement academies for years to come. Meanwhile, the administrative aftermath was just beginning. Marcus's security clearance would need to be reviewed, his fitness for any future federal employment would be questioned, and the entire incident would generate reports that would circulate through Pentagon offices for months. The bureaucratic machinery of national security doesn't pause for individual human suffering, even when that suffering stems from service to the country. Sarah Rodriguez arrived on scene, just as the federal agents were beginning their preliminary interviews. She had been dreading this moment for years, knowing that Marcus's untreated trauma would eventually manifest in some kind of public crisis. Seeing him surrounded by federal agents and emergency responders confirmed her worst fears about how society handles veterans who struggle with invisible wounds. "Has anyone explained to him that this isn't his fault?" Sarah asked Dr. Williams as they watched Marcus being interviewed by federal agents. "He's going to blame himself for all of this." Dr. Williams nodded grimly. The psychological aftermath of the incident would likely be more damaging to Marcus than the original trauma that had triggered it. Public humiliation, federal investigation, and media attention would all combine to reinforce his existing feelings of guilt and failure. The media response was swift and largely predictable. News reports described a veteran's meltdown that had required federal intervention, with most coverage focusing on the spectacular nature of the response rather than the underlying issues that had caused the crisis. Conservative commentators used the incident to argue for stricter monitoring of veterans with mental health issues, while progressive voices pointed to it as evidence of inadequate support for returning service members. Neither perspective captured the full complexity of what had actually happened. Marcus Rodriguez wasn't a dangerous individual who needed to be controlled. He was a highly trained professional whose skills had been weaponized by trauma in a way that made him seem threatening when he was actually just terrified and confused. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes arrived from Washington that afternoon to conduct a comprehensive review of the incident. Her job was to determine whether any classified information had been compromised, whether federal response protocols had been appropriate, and what lessons could be learned for future similar situations. The subject demonstrated remarkable restraint given his training and psychological state, Hayes noted in her preliminary report. Despite believing he was under attack by hostile forces, he did not attempt to seriously harm any law enforcement personnel. This suggests that his moral framework remained intact even during severe psychological distress. The analysis revealed something important about Marcus that would influence how his case was handled going forward. Despite his complete disconnection from reality, some part of his mind had recognized that the enemy forces he was facing were actually trying to help him. His military discipline had prevented him from using lethal force, even when his trauma-conditioned reflexes were telling him he was fighting for his life. Crawford spent several hours with Marcus that afternoon, helping him process what had happened and connecting him with VA resources that specialized in combat-related psychological injuries. As his former commanding officer, Crawford felt personally responsible for ensuring that Marcus received proper care rather than just federal scrutiny. "You did everything right out there," Crawford told Marcus during their private conversation. "Your training kept you alive in Afghanistan, and it kept everyone safe today. That's not something to be ashamed of." But Marcus struggled to accept that perspective. He had always prided himself on maintaining control and completing missions successfully. The idea that his military training had been turned against him by his own mind was almost impossible for him to process. The long-term implications of the incident extended far beyond Marcus's personal situation. Federal agencies began developing new protocols for identifying and responding to veterans experiencing severe psychological distress. The Pentagon initiated a review of how former special operations personnel were transitioned back to civilian life, particularly those with high-level security clearances and specialized training. 3 months later, Marcus was participating in an intensive PTSD treatment program specifically designed for former intelligence operatives. The therapy was provided at a secure VA facility that understood the unique challenges faced by veterans who couldn't discuss their service experiences due to classification restrictions. Sarah had become an advocate for military families dealing with similar issues, speaking at congressional hearings about the need for better support systems for returning service members. Her testimony helped generate bipartisan support for legislation expanding mental health resources for veterans with combat-related psychological injuries. The bus stop on Madison Street became an unlikely symbol of the challenges facing American veterans. A small memorial plaque was installed recognizing the service and sacrifice of military personnel dealing with invisible wounds, though few passersby understood the specific incident that had inspired it. Marcus eventually returned to productive civilian life, working as a counselor for other veterans struggling with combat trauma. His experience with federal crisis response gave him unique credibility when helping other former service members navigate the complex intersection of military training, psychological injury, and civilian society. The incident report remained classified, but its lessons influenced federal policy for years to come. Training scenarios based on Marcus's case became standard for crisis response teams, teaching them to recognize when apparent criminal behavior might actually be a medical emergency requiring specialized intervention. Looking back, everyone involved agreed that the federal response had been both necessary and successful. A potentially deadly situation had been resolved without serious injury to anyone, including Marcus himself. But the incident also highlighted the ongoing challenge of supporting veterans whose skills and training sometimes made them seem dangerous when they were actually just suffering from wounds that society preferred to ignore. Marcus Rodriguez never did make it to his original VA appointment that Tuesday morning, but the crisis that prevented him from seeking help ultimately connected him to resources and treatment that might have taken years to access through normal channels. Sometimes the most circuitous path leads to exactly where someone needs to go, even when that journey involves federal agents, Pentagon crisis teams, and enough bureaucracy to fill multiple filing cabinets.